Welcome to today's conversation on holding together. I'm delighted and privileged to welcome three distinguished colleagues today to speak to you about the challenges facing the United States today and what we can do together to foster a rights renewal. We'll first hear from John Shattuck, who's a professor of practice and diplomacy at the Fletcher School here. He's also been a senior fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights School for several years, where I've had the privilege and honor of working with him to collaborate on this book. If we read out all of John's tremendous achievements, we'll be here for a couple of hours. So suffice to say that John has had a distinguished career in academia, in government, in nonprofit organizations, and it's really a privilege to hear from him. We'll hear first from John, and we'll then hear from Professor Eileen Babbitt, who is a professor here at Tufts. She's a professor of practice of international conflict management, director of an institute, director of the program on human rights and conflict resolution, and really a leading expert on conflict resolution, coexistence, and trust building in the aftermath of civil war. We'll also hear from Dean Dana Cunningham, who is the Pierre and Pamela Omidyar Dean of Tufts University's Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Life, which studies and promotes the civic and political engagement of young people at Tufts University in our communities and in our democracy. She's had extensive experience working in the academic and philanthropic and nonprofit sector prior to joining Tufts. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Sushma Raman, co-author of the book, Holding Together, The Hijacking of Rights in America and How to Reclaim Them for Everyone. I'm the executive director of the Carr Center at the Kennedy School, and it's really my honor and pleasure to be here with you today. I'd also like to acknowledge Professor Matthias Riese, who's a co-author with us and the faculty director of the Carr Center. So I'm going to turn it over to you, John, to walk us through a brief overview of where we are today with respect to the status of rights and why we should be hopeful. And then we're going to hear from Professor Babbitt and Dean Cunningham, and we'll have a conversation. I might share some thoughts as well along the way.
Yeah. Good. Thank you, Sushma, so much. I think because we have slides and I'd like to be able to direct them, I'm going to go to the podium here. And I want to welcome everyone, but particularly Eileen Babbitt, an old colleague and distinguished professor here, and Dana Cunningham, who's doing a superb job running the Tisch College and is an inspiration, I think, for civic engagement to people around the country. We've written a book, Sushma and I and Matthias Riese, which is, it goes a little bit against the grain, which is, this is a time when there's a lot of hand-wringing about the crisis of human rights in the United States. There is indeed a crisis of human rights in the United States and all over the world. And I want to pay tribute especially to the people of Ukraine who are on the front lines of this crisis and all that they are doing to demonstrate the importance of mobilizing resistance to those who would take away a democracy and human rights for whole countries, indeed, and beyond. So why this book goes against the grain is that it tries to present you with a relatively optimistic perspective about where the struggle for human rights in the United States might go. It's a book about values, the values of democracy and human rights, and why are those values so important? I think to put this in the perspective of the US, we need to understand that we are living in a country of unprecedented diversity. And it is a nation that has been built, unlike others, which are often built on common ancestry and connections within the country. Our nation has been built, as we all know, on waves of immigration, also on a history of enslavement and the subjugation of its indigenous population. So it has a very complex history as a nation. Americans have been thrown together over the centuries by chance and exploitation, but they've been held together by a belief, which is expressed in the Declaration of Independence, that all people are created equal and have rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think without this belief, which Americans share, despite the tremendous diversity, there never would have been a nation called the United States. It is the founding belief. Now, the founders, as I think many people know, were an elite slice of the population. And they were white men with property. And they had an exclusive view of human rights at that time, not surprisingly, a view that rights were for white men with property. So indeed, we had a founding fallacy, which we have overcome through struggle. This notorious founding exclusion has been challenged throughout American history in the ongoing struggle for equal rights, battles for liberty and equality that took place before, during, and after the Civil War, before, during, and after the Civil Rights Revolution of the 20th century, which is in many respects ongoing. These are what define Americans. They are battles for rights, the rights of all citizens to vote, the rights to equal protection and equal opportunity, the right to freedom of speech and religion, the right to individual dignity, a very important central right, not expressed specifically in the Constitution, but in, I believe, the hearts and minds of all who strive for it. And above all, a right to a democratic form of government. So this is what has defined what it is to be an American in a country of unprecedented diversity. Now today, and that's what our book is about, these rights are under assault, both by foreign enemies, like the enemies that are attacking Ukraine, and by homegrown attackers. And it's the homegrown attackers in the United States that I'd like to spend a few minutes describing. But what do Americans today think about their rights and responsibilities as citizens? To find out, for our book, we conducted a series of polls, and we also had town hall meetings, which gave us a sense of what the American public thought. These polls were conducted by one of the top nonpartisan polling organizations in the United States. The organization is called the National Opinions Research Center at the University of Chicago. And the results were quite remarkable. What we found was that 80% of Americans today, across the political spectrum, believe that without our rights, America is nothing. That was the core finding of the entire poll, which is that without our rights, there is no country, there are no people, we are all struggling against each other. So there's a deep feeling on the part of 80% that rights are at the core. Last year, 2 years ago, our first poll showed that more than 70% of Americans believed that they had more in common than many people think, despite all the division. 2 years ago, our first poll showed that it was 70%, but last year, this more in common view was held by an even larger percentage, 80%, even after 2 years of COVID, economic crisis, attacks on the presidential election, and the insurrection at the Capitol. So now on the surface, these results would seem to be very much at odds with the division and extremism that we see in the country. But when we dig deeper, I think we find that the great majority of Americans have a complex view of their rights, even when they are in disagreement about so many other things, a complex view which they agree on. They know that rights aren't absolute and have to be balanced against responsibilities. For example, 8 out of 10 agree that personal freedom has to be balanced against the responsibility to keep people safe in a pandemic. 8 out of 10 agree that the police can protect the public from crime while also being held accountable for violations of civil rights, something that we don't normally think is the case in the United States. 7 out of 10 agree that the Second Amendment to the Constitution, which guarantees the right to bear arms, should not keep the government from regulating guns to protect public safety. So most Americans, we found in our poll, reject what are known as the culture wars that are being waged at the political extremes, because they don't live at the extremes, but rather they live across the broad political center. Now, it's true that they can be drawn to the extremes and have been by disinformation or propaganda, but their instincts tell them they prefer the center. 72% agree that they're fed up with polarization, that politicians are intentionally dividing our country, and that political leaders of different parties should work together to find solutions to the country's problems. Now, the polls show that the pandemic, which of course we have all lived with now for what seems like centuries, even though it's only been 2 years, the pandemic actually caused a majority of Americans to have more, not less, respect for others. 76% now say that, and I quote, "The events of the last 2 years have made me think more positively toward Americans of different races or ethnicities." The pandemic also dramatically increased public support for economic rights, a right to health care, now favored by 75% of Americans, a right to education, 72%, a right to housing, 71%. The bottom line, and this is really the central feature of this book and the polling that's been done to launch it, is that a large majority of Americans have an expansive view of the system of rights that's at the heart of democracy, not only in the United States, but democracy written large around the world, even though it's very much under assault. This silent majority, and that's what I would call it, of 70 to 80%, silent because we don't hear from it very often, and we don't tend to even know sometimes that it exists, is demographically and politically diverse, Democrats, independents, and many Republicans, who disagree on many issues but have a common commitment to democratic values. The silent majority has the potential, we say, to hold the country together, but its political diversity prevents it from being very cohesive, and therefore it's constantly in danger of losing to a destructive minority that is actively working to divide the country and to destroy democracy. And that is the crisis of human rights and democracy in the US. This destructive minority of roughly 20 to 30% under our polls is made up of a white, hardcore base of anti-democracy supporters who want to take away the rights of people or groups that they regard as racial, cultural, or political enemies. Their cause in 2021, as we know, was overturning the presidential election by spreading false claims about voter fraud, claims that were unanimously rejected by judges and election officials across the country as false. And because their anti-democracy campaign failed, the destructive minority of 20 to 30% is now trying to change the rules of the game. And that is the crisis of democracy. The crisis of human rights is that the destructive minority is trying to take away people's rights. Now, there are 4 groups. They're the leaders, political opportunists, and entrepreneurs like Donald Trump and the politicians jockeying to succeed him, who, let me switch to the slide, who promote lies and fears and grievances to attack their enemies and keep their followers in line. Second are the organizers and supporters who see the promise of equal rights as a threat to their status, voting rights as a threat to their demographic dominance. racial equality as a threat to their self-described racial supremacy, public health as a threat to their self-centered personal freedom. The third group of hijackers come from the courts, especially the Supreme Court, where recent appointments have led to decisions denying rights that a majority of Americans want to see protected. And finally, the fourth group are the extremist media and social media that instigate or facilitate the spread of political lies and disinformation. So these four groups are attacking rights that have broad support across the silent majority. And how are they doing this? First, by undermining the electoral process. 35 new state laws over the last year have been adopted by state legislatures that are dominated by the failed Trump campaign, making it harder to vote while removing protections against racial discrimination in voting. But our polls show that a majority of Americans actually want to strengthen the right to vote. For example, 84% want the Justice Department to review new state or local voting regulations to ensure they don't discriminate against voters based on race. The voting rights hijackers are also working to turn vote counting over to partisan officials who can then swing the election results. Beyond voting rights, the hijackers are attacking the basic principles of equal protection and due process, which are at the heart of the American system of rights. They've rolled back the enforcement of civil rights, but this rollback is opposed by 8 out of 10 Americans who agree that the laws against racial discrimination in housing and employment should be strengthened. They have a whole variety of ways in which they have attacked rights. For example, the political attacks against the rights of women for legal access to abortion have greatly increased. And the Supreme Court is now poised to overturn the constitutional right in Roe versus Wade. But that, too, is out of step with public opinion. Bipartisan majority of 72% agree that a woman's ability to make decisions affecting her personal life should be protected, and on and on. So, as we can see, the rights that we have as Americans, which are more general for democracies around the world as well, are under assault by this minority, this destructive minority. On the other hand, they are rejected by the silent majority, which strongly favors all the rights that are under attack. So what can be done to channel support for equal rights to enacting policies to protect the rights that are under attack? Let me move to this. So, we need to reach across partisan divides and talk to people on the other side. The silent majority is made up of all kinds of people, including many who disagree on everything except the defense of democracy, and they should be mobilized to support reform. There are reforms that cut across and appeal to majorities of Democrats, Republicans, and independents, and we should be able to enact those as a start. For example, privacy of personal information, which is supported by 95% of our polling data, and on and on. The hijackers have attacked rights in many areas where the silent majority actually supports the strengthening, for example, of the right to vote, where the majority wants national standards, wants early and absentee voting. And a big issue that cuts across partisan lines today is the growing public outrage at economic inequality. Here again, based on our polling results, it's possible to build a left-right coalition for economic rights, for example, in healthcare and education, where 75% of Americans call for more government spending. So we need to organize at the local level, all sorts of campaigns to shore up and help local officials who are trying to prevent the hijacking of rights. For example, the election officials in the battleground states who courageously resisted Trump's pressure to change the election results and are now targeted by the hijackers, and the local campaigns are needed to defend them. Campaigns can be organized by community groups who become political advocates. For example, suburban mothers who stand up to attacks on teachers by people who want to stop schools from teaching about racism. Finally, I think to defend democracy, we need to strengthen our civic education in the schools. Last year, nearly half of all public high school seniors couldn't name the 3 branches of government in the United States, and only half of the schools were teaching the history of slavery. Civic education is at the heart of democracy, as Benjamin Franklin pointed out at the Constitutional Convention. He was asked by a citizen what kind of government the nation should have, and he famously replied, "A republic if you can keep it." Now, Franklin would have been shocked, I think, to find today how few citizens actually understand their responsibilities in a democracy. So this is our blueprint for reviving democratic values. The stakes are high. The attacks on democracy in Ukraine and around the world and the hijacking of rights here at home dramatize those stakes. If democratic values are able to be hijacked and suppressed, there will be far-reaching global consequences, including the loss of international respect, leverage, and leadership for democratic countries, and the increasing influence of authoritarian leaders when democracy and human rights are undermined from within. So we need to defend the values that hold a democracy together when it's under attack, from hijackers who are trying to steal rights or authoritarians who are trying to steal countries, as in the case of Ukraine. So let me close with the words of John Lewis, to whom we dedicate our book, the former congressman and great civil rights leader, words about the ongoing struggle for freedom. Lewis said, "Freedom is not a state, it is an act. It is not some enchanted garden perched high on a distant plateau where we can finally sit down and rest. Freedom is the continuous action we all must take, and each generation must do its part." So thank you. I look forward to the discussion, and I recommend the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. For those of you who are watching on Zoom, we welcome your questions in the Zoom chat, which is being monitored, and we will draw upon them during the course of this conversation. So John, you've raised some really important points about the erosion and attrition and attacks on rights and the implications for our individual freedoms, liberty, capabilities, as well as the impact on US society and indeed the impact on global democratic trends. So we're going to now hear from Professor Babbitt, who will reflect on some of the themes in the book, and then we'll hear from Dean Cunningham.
Great. Thank you, Shushma. Hi, everybody. It is very heartening, John, to see these polling numbers and the percentages of people who seem to agree on rights as the foundation of our society. As you said, it's not what our daily experience would tell us, but this is really encouraging, and it's clearly a call to action, the book. As a person who focuses on negotiation and conflict resolution, the action that it speaks, that says to me, is the building of coalitions, that we really do have to reach out, both coalitions of those who agree and then trying to build these cross-cutting coalitions that you've mentioned. I first want to talk about the amplifying of the advocacy coalitions. The people who are active now in many of the issue areas that you've identified, voting rights, Black Lives Matter, gun control, et cetera, these coalitions have become much more emboldened, I think, as the rights erosion that you've described has also ratcheted up. I want to mention a couple of organizations in particular because they were spearheaded in part by Fletcher graduates. So I want us to all take a little bit of pride in that. The first is an organization called Indivisible. Many of you might know about it. It calls itself a movement of progressive grassroots activism. It has chapters in every state in the United States. And these chapters are autonomous. They are able to act on local issues, building on local values, local coalitions, but there is an overarching national strategy and a national leadership that helps build capacity building, does advising on strategic actions and coordination across states, so that if something needs to happen regionally or nationally, they can activate these local networks and partnerships. The co-director of the National Coalition and National Organization is Leah Greenberg, who's a Fletcher grad, and their National Development Director is also a Fletcher graduate, a young woman named Casey Hogle. So I urge you to look at their organization and see about what's happening in the states from which you come or in which you live or you have family or friends. The second group I want to mention is something called the Horizons Project. It's a fairly new organization. It's being funded by something called the New Ventures Fund, and they are building a network of networks. So this is a group that's calling upon the democracy building groups, the peace building groups, the social justice groups to act in concert with each other. And they're trying to build connections across these existing coalitions, help people learn about what's working, develop coordinated strategies. And when there seems to be tension between various agendas, democracy building versus social justice, for example, they want to help coordinate and facilitate conversations to work through those tensions. One of the leaders is a woman named Maria Stefan, who's also a Fletcher graduate. In her days at Fletcher and thereafter, her focus was on civic action and nonviolent strategy, nonviolent movements. So she brings that focus and expertise to that endeavor. However, we can't be too complacent about all the people who agree with each other. We do have to recognize that on the other side of the 70% who agree, there's the 30% who don't. And what do we do about that? Because as John said, they're the people who are maybe on the extremes can do a lot of damage and impede a lot of progress. And in my view, that's a more personal struggle, because that happens in conversation. That happens in individual families, communities, relationships, where we talk to each other about the things about which we disagree. These are very hard conversations, difficult conversations in the language of conflict resolution. And I want to bring your attention to another resource in this regard, a local organization here in Cambridge called, or here in the Boston area called Essential Partners. Also co-directed by a Fletcher graduate, Katie Hijacking. Essential Partners has actually been a partner of Tufts for quite a long time. And the peer mediators and facilitators who operate at Tufts have all been trained by Essential Partners. I bring them into my classes to do training on dialogue and facilitation. Their work is called Reflective Dialogue Practice, and they have tremendous resources that are available on their website, all for free, including literal step-by-step guides, dealing with racism, dealing with the disagreements after an election. And they give you actual words to say and things to think about so that you can have conversations with your colleagues, with your family, with people in your communities. And I just want to leave you with a couple of the elements of this kind of reflective dialogue practice that is so very, very important. The first is the idea of speaking to be understood. And what this actually means is thinking about how you express your opinions so that you're not escalating the conversation, but you're trying to find a way to say what you believe and what the motivation is behind your feelings and your thoughts in a way that the other person can actually hear you. So you're not initiating debate and you're not trying to get into a right-wrong conversation. These are very difficult conversations to have because things can get very heated because we care a lot about these issues. But learning how to speak in a way that opens the conversation rather than closing it is very important. The second piece is listening to understand, which is really hearing what other people are saying and asking questions out of sincere curiosity, not to score points, not to create, again, a win-lose kind of conversation, but really asking people, why do you care about this? What is so important about this? And then listening to what it is that they have to say, trying to withhold your judgment and trying to check out your own assumptions about what is and isn't motivating them. Again, not an easy thing to be doing. These are hard conversations in families, they're hard in communities. I just read an article yesterday that we better hurry up and have these conversations in our communities because we are literally in the United States starting to physically sort ourselves into conservative and liberal communities. And as legislation is being passed at the state levels in parts of the country, people are literally leaving those states, or they're going to those states if they believe that those laws will amplify their values. This is very frightening to me because it means that then we don't even have people in our communities with whom we can have these conversations because everybody has physically voted with their feet, so to speak. So I'm trying to stay optimistic, as John has encouraged us to do. I do believe in the power of people and people reaching out, and I think we all have a lot of work to do.
Thank you. Raised some very important points, the importance of building strong organizations and movements around specific communities or causes. The second level really is bridging those divides with other communities and causes to build solidarities. And then finally reaching out across the political, the religious, the community aisle to build rapport and shared values perhaps with those who disagree with us, and where is there a shared platform or a set of shared values. So very, very important work for us for the coming years. Thank you. Dana?
So I just have to tell you that as we are sitting here, speaking of resources for people to engage in, I got an email from somebody who was watching. So a colleague, board member at Tisch and friend, JB Lyon, who said, I'm watching this, I need the data. So please, virtuous circle here of like spreading the news of this really useful data. And thank you, JB, for watching. So a couple things I want to just pipe in, and really interested in getting to the discussion with the audience, both virtual and in the room. So first, I just want to say that I so appreciated, you said, John, I recommend this book. I recommend this book too. And in particular, not just for the optimistic outlook that it presents, but also for the nuanced discussion of all of the different experiences of exclusion. I think that's a really, really important thing. Black is different from Latinx, is different from LGBTQ, and understanding how our structures exclude in the practice of democracy all of these different groups is critically important for us to be able to address the exclusions. And I believe when you understand those particularities, you're actually able to create more broadly applicable, through the particularities, more broadly applicable solutions. So that's the first thing. I was just really, really excited to see that. Second thing I want to say is, I thought this identification of structural barriers was also really thoroughgoing and really important, and I haven't seen much of that. So just really appreciated. I have to tell you, as a lawyer, it broke my heart to see the Supreme Court as a hacker of democracy. I agree. But what that means about the state of crisis that we are in is really hard to get your mind around. What does that actually mean? But I want to, and I also want to say that the alignment both on the issues, voter protection, gun control, legalized abortion, and the alignment around values, the importance of freedom and the frailty, the importance of rights and their frailty, I think that needs to be problematized a little bit. And that's where I think also I actually want to problematize a little bit this formulation about there's a 70% supermajority and a 30%, and then there's a small, dangerous, anti-democratic minority. I worry about that for a couple of reasons. One, because 71 million people voted for Trump. That's not a small, dangerous minority. And I think creating this narrative about there's a small anti-democratic band, I don't disagree with you that there are hackers and dangerous demagogues and activists working to undermine democracy. But I think there's something deeper going on. And there's this little phrase you have in there that really struck me, which is demographic anxiety. I would also call that, that was me. I would also call that racial anxiety and anxiety about being racially overwhelmed. There's another word for it that comes out of our history, and it is white supremacy. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, not because I want to polarize, but because I really want to identify something that I think we are going to have to figure out how to address, and I have some thoughts about it, and I'll try to be quick. So I think, and you guys do a really good job of identifying this as well. You talk about, so let me back up for a minute. So what do these values mean? What does freedom mean? I think freedom means something very different to a working class white man in the heartland as compared to an LGBTQ Black person in a hoodie. And I think, and that's a really important distinction. So to me, what I think is that freedom has a very libertarian flavor to it in the heartland, in the white working class heartland, I think. And I think for the Black youth in a hoodie, I think it is stop the violence. It is intervene, not hands off in that sense, but intervene to right profound historical wrongs that contribute to all of the data you have about inequality. And so to say we all agree on the idea that freedom is important doesn't help us reach people about actually what is important to them about freedom. And I think that's a really important thing for us to get at and address. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, where do these differences come from? How is it that there is such a, despite the fact that we agree on these sentences, that they mean such different things to us. And I think you guys also do a good job of talking about these key points in history. And you talk a little bit about Reconstruction, and you talk about the New Deal. And I would add to that the 2008 economic collapse, where there are these pivot points in American history in which we have an opportunity to move towards a more inclusive and just nation, and our institutions and our practices and even our economic arrangements are more aligned along inclusion and equity, or we can move in the other direction towards greater extraction and polarization. And in each of those cases, with Reconstruction and then the violent military overthrow of Reconstruction, you remember that the North was militarily occupying the South. When I used to do work in the South as a voting rights lawyer, people would talk about our war, and they weren't talking about Vietnam or World War II. They were still talking about the Civil War. For them, it was a military occupation of a nation. And that was overthrown, that military occupation. The North withdrew its troops. It was a military, anyway, I've said it. So that was the first one, when there was a chance. Reconstruction had so many important provisions for attempting to make whole a group of people who had been for 300 years extracted from. Instead, we withdrew the troops and ended that experiment. The next was the New Deal. During the New Deal, and this again is in your book, really well detailed, how the New Deal is credited with having created the American middle class with home ownership and education, benefits. But those things were denied to Black and brown people. So you see, again, another moment when there's an acceleration of inclusion and well-being for certain groups in the country. For others, there's an explicit extraction. Similarly with the Affordable Care Act during the era, in the era of Obama, you have the racialization again of benefits and extraction of wealth. And so these things, I say, the reason by the way, these changes, these retractions also hurt whites. But through the invocation of white identity, of this idea of supremacy, there was misleadership and misguidance, much in the way today the Trump movement is invoking white identity and demographic anxiety to push proposals that hurt everybody. So I've said enough about how we got to this place where the experiences are so different that we mean different things in the same sentence. I want to just say how I think we address that. And I love this recommendation about organizing at the local level, about investing in civic life in communities. And I want to say two things. I want to speak specifically to the role of universities, because that's where we are right now. And I want to tell you about this shocking finding, which you may know about, that the Pew Research Center did. 40% of Americans think that higher education is a danger to their communities. Has anybody here heard that data? No. You can attribute that to pure ignorance and to know-nothingism. But I actually think it's deeper than that. Again, I think we need to problematize. When you think about how universities sit within communities with high walls, unaffordable tuitions, don't pay taxes, and kind of create a hub of knowledge that does not include the surrounding neighborhoods, you think, well, maybe they're not so wrong about this idea that this is a danger to us who live here. I have to say, I think Tufts is different. And I don't think I think Tufts is different. And I think Tufts is different in part because of Tisch College, of which I am extremely proud. But in a larger sense, because we say that civic life is at the core of our educational mission. And so I just want to take a second to talk about that. I think in this moment that is approaching, when by 2050, there will be no single racial or ethnic majority, and you guys speak about that in the book, we need a whole different way of creating knowledge about the problems that are facing us. And the problems are existential. We know that. We know environmental crisis, we know wealth disparities, we know racial inequality. And so we need new ways of creating knowledge. And so I'm a big fan of John Dewey and Paulo Freire and Gloria Andelzua, all of whom talk about the critical importance of co-creating knowledge for democracy. And so what I think universities have to do more of is partner with the communities in which they live. This is something that Tisch does. This is something that Tufts does. Entertain, engage, explore, investigate the questions that are pressing within the communities in which we live and communities beyond where we live. Within the exploration of those problems are really important insights about institutional failure, about ecological stewardship. And we'll never get to that sort of on the ground, immediate insight if we aren't working with communities, combining these different kinds of knowledge that we have, expertise, technical expertise from an academic perspective with lived experience from confronting crisis every day in your life. And when we begin to do that, then I think we have the kind of infrastructure for democracy that Ben Franklin, that John Dewey, and others have talked about. So I really look forward to engaging in this conversation. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Dana. That really resonated with me. And I think I was that person who kept speaking up saying, you know, when we think of rights and we think of freedoms, are the people who are saying, yes, this is important to us, are they talking about the freedom perhaps to not wear a mask or the right to carry a gun? What types of rights and freedoms are we talking about? Is it the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Is it other conceptions of rights and freedoms? And I think you've very beautifully and eloquently captured some of the dilemmas of creating a shared concept of rights in this very, very contested landscape. So I'm going to ask each person a quick question and with hopefully a brief response. And in the meantime, I'd love for all of you to think of your questions that you might have, whether for a specific person or for the panel at large. And John, I'm going to start with you. The opening, the preface, the foreword was written by Martha Minow, the former dean of Harvard Law School, who's an amazing scholar and just a wonderful human being. And her first sentence says, rights are both ideals and measures of the shortfall of human activities. So I'm wondering, as you look to the future with your recommendations, do you recommend that we focus on the ideals and values that rights embody, or should we really focus on the shortfalls, the inadequacies, the rollbacks, the attacks, both over the last 5 years, but also over the past several decades?
I think we need to do both. It's not easy to imagine how to do both, but right now, to be very practical about it, and I think the book has a practical side as well as an effort to try to recognize the broader ideals that we're striving for. We're in a practical crisis where everything is sliding backwards, and if we aren't able to reverse the slide to go forward on something like voting rights, for example, the whole system is going to continue to erode. And no matter how much we project the ideal that we may wish to pursue in certain aspects of rights, if we aren't able to actually do something practical, then we're not going to save the system. But I think at the same time, and here I appreciate what both Eileen and Dana said. You know, we need to learn how to talk to each other about these issues and try to find ways in which not so much the ideal, but the broader concept of what it means to have human dignity. And it means something different depending on who you are and where you're sitting. And, you know, whether you're the kid in the neighborhood with a hoodie or whether you're somebody who's a professor at a university. I mean, they all have very, very different perspectives on this. So we need to find a way to talk about the broader concept of rights, in addition to doing the practical things that need to be done right now. And the book is full of specific recommendations about things that can be done right now if we organize properly and do more to enter the political arena. Then we need to do those. But we need to keep in mind also the broader concepts as well.
Thank you. So Eileen, I would love to take the examples you gave about solidarities and translate that to the global level. We're seeing an all-out assault on rights and democracy around the world. We just heard about the re-election of Viktor Orban in Hungary. You know, and we see this in other countries where you have authoritarians both elected and appointed. And what are your thoughts about how we could resuscitate rights in countries where democracies are under assault? Does this involve global cross-border solidarities? Does it involve support for civil society on the ground? How do you envision rights revival? Because as John mentioned, the decline in democracy in the US has also had repercussions around the world.
I guess for me, the key is always civil society. It's always the mobilization of communities and people, and supporting that mobilization, and really hearing what it is that people say. Your comments, Dana, about how these things mean different things to different people in different contexts. We often make assumptions about what these things mean to people. We project onto certain communities and et cetera. And we don't really listen when people speak about what they really do care about. And I think Americans in particular are pretty dismissive generally of other countries mainly, and assume that we know what's happening in Hungary, we know what's happening in Ukraine, maybe we don't. Maybe we have to have a bit more humility, but we also have to ask and listen. And that's where the coalitions across communities and across countries needs to begin, is actually connecting and listening to what people are telling us. And it's very difficult because we might not hear things that we would like to hear, but we have to operate from reality and truth rather than from our assumptions and some kind of projection of what we think people want and who we think people are. So I would say we have to start with civil society and ourselves. I mean, each of us has a place here to be very clear about who we are and what we care about, and listen to the people in our circles as well as people, more far flung.
Thank you. Dana, I'd like to ask you about, as we look to the future, how to ensure we center racial justice and equity in these broad discussions around democracy in the US. There have been many on the progressive front who have said, oh, let's put aside these conversations on race, they're a distraction. Let's focus on other issues, like we want to elect certain people or we don't want to alienate certain people. My own personal view is that the the historical legacy of enslavement, the decades after slavery, all of that have contributed both to the current perilous state of democracy, but also have contributed to the incredible accumulation of capital in the United States by certain groups. And so is this really a multiracial democracy, or is it really a project of racial capitalism? And how do we address and center racial equity in future efforts to revive democracy?
So I think that actually is the question for this moment. Is it a multiracial democracy, or is it a project of racial capitalism? That is the question. And I think the answer is we don't know yet. That is the work. That is the John Lewis quote, freedom is a verb, or however he said it, right? Freedom is an action. And so two things I want to say. One is I want to put in a plug for another resource, which is new at Tufts. It is the GLADSEA, which is the Generous Listening and Dialogue Center,
Right.
right?
Right,
Which
yes, exactly.
is building capacities with tools and convenings and processes on the campus to help people learn how to listen differently. And so I cannot underscore enough that at the end of the day, we have to have civil society as the bedrock of democracy. And of course, government can take action to undermine civil society. So there's a relationship there. But I think what we have within our hands is civil society. So I think, I talked a lot about this invocation of a white identity. I believe that's part of the racial capitalism project, that you invoke white identity as a distraction from the extraction of wealth from all of us, right? It's not, right? So it is, and that in each of these turning points that I was talking about before, it was that turn that was so effective each time. So I think I want to bring in the word empathy here. I think empathy is a crucial building block of civil society. And I want to bring in another word, which is solidarity, which you all use. So empathy and solidarity as core functionalities of democracy. Dewey said that the thing that will define a thriving democracy is a widespread tendency among the populace towards empathy, that you're not just in your first response willing to otherize the person, whether that person is a Trump supporter or a transgender kid in a hoodie, but that you are willing to contemplate the responsibilities of upholding a beloved community. And so, I mean, maybe that sounds corny and maybe it sounds Pollyanna-ish, but at the end of the day, I used to do this work in Colombia, in the nation of Colombia, in the Afro region. It was 80% Afro-Colombian and place of tremendous violence and extraction. And I made a presentation about the importance of love. And my team was like urging me to like make this presentation about, at the end of the day, you've got to go with empathy and love. And my knees were shaking because I'm looking at people who are facing car bombings and gang violence and all kinds of horrific conditions. And so I gave the speech that my team insisted that I give. And when I got finished, somebody came up to me and said, nobody comes and talks about love to us here. We talk about love with each other, and we know it is actually all we have at the end of the day is love. And so that's like a rigorous discipline of empathy. It's justice. That's the kind of love I'm talking about. I'm not talking about, sort of hazy romantic ideas about love, but what does it take for us in our civic spaces to promote that kind of feeling towards each other as citizens, as being included within our circle of concern? And I think that is the work of building multiracial democracy at its very, very core.
Mhm.
Beautiful, beautifully said. So the book, in case you're wondering, the full title is Holding Together: The Hijacking of Rights in America and How to Reclaim Them for Everyone. It's available at the New Press. It's also available on pre-order at your local bookstore or online. I will not mention the online retailer in question. So any questions that you might have in the audience? Yes.
Just as far but like I'm thinking of the New Deal specifically, like say like the wealth gap between families. Also, the second part of my question is we're talking about education and fixing education.
Thank you.
How would that how does that help the fact that education is not affordable for most people? So if you're fixing like the institution, what benefit does that really have if people can afford it?
I think that's directed at me. Yeah.
I don't remember you.
I'm Dana. So the first part, I remember the education part, but what was the part before that?
Just
The wealth gap.
Yeah.
So this could be a whole other forum that we could do. But I actually believe, I was once in a conversation with a libertarian who said the only thing that government should do is raise armies and deliver the mail. And I said, if we just focused on the government's ability to raise armies and deliver the mail and thought inclusively about how the government spends money to raise armies, and I don't agree with this, I'm just saying, just taking his starting point. If we thought about how the government spends money to raise armies and deliver the mail, that alone, the vast purchasing power of the government could make a huge difference in wealth creation or destruction. Now, I think government should do much more than that. I think government, I don't believe in a government that's sort of a negative, how do you say it, like a negative assertion of rights. We will leave you alone to do the things you want to do. No, I believe governments should be responsible for making their citizenry flourish. I think governments should love people. But if you were only to look at that, there's tremendous power of the government to create and undermine markets that create wealth. And I think that is a question of civil society mobilizing itself to understand all the ways that citizens are economic actors and can use their economic power just like they use all their other forms of civic power. So that's a longer discussion I'd love to have at some point, but I think eradicating poverty, I'm not going to say ending wealth inequality, but eradicating poverty and advancing significantly human flourishing is possible. It is within our reach, and it is both through government action, but significantly through unleashing markets in ways that we never do to help a broader swath of people create wealth. And I'll stop there because other people want to get in.
Let me just make one quick addendum to that very, very good answer, Dana. There is an opportunity, I think, based on the polling that we did for our book, to put together a remarkable coalition to deal with the issues that you're talking about. I'm not talking about a civil society coalition necessarily, although that clearly should be where it's centered, but a political coalition across the spectrum, the left and the right, and an interracial and a multiracial coalition, because I think the issues of economic inequality are now rising to the very top of many people's agenda in the United States, whether they are very conservative. I mean, they may, libertarians perhaps not, because they tend to push this into another category. But certainly there are so many people who are suffering from and all being exploited by the economic inequality that has developed in this, as you put it, racial capitalism, or any other way to put it. So this is a moment of opportunity, and I think it's going to take some political leadership to put that moment together. And at the moment, I don't see anybody who's doing that, but I think it's a real opportunity.
Can I just ask you a question? Is there also an implication in your question about whether, because of wealth inequality and educational inequality, people either cannot or will not participate in civic action? Or was that not part of your question?
No, I don't think that was.
Okay.
But it's an interesting thing to think about.
I mean, because clearly the civic part of all that we're describing and the official actions of governments and institutions are not unrelated. And the hope, of course, is that one influences the other positively. And so the changes that you're hoping for, I guess I would say, are only possible if we all mobilize across different economic and educational spectrums.
Are there questions online? Maybe we'll draw.
Yes, we have one question on it. Well, we have multiple, but this one. Okay, so from the audience online, one question we had was for Professor Shattuck. Is that correct? Yes. On essentially the question is, how do you propose local organizations or organizers bridge the gap in interest and resources without using similarly polarizing frameworks to get their own message across?
Good question.
I'm not sure I fully got that. Could you just state it again? I'm sorry. I see the heads nodding over here, but you got them, but I didn't.
How do you propose local organizers bridge the gap in interest and resources without using similarly polarizing frameworks to get their personal message across?
Okay. Yeah. Well, in other words, how do you build bridges of the kind that Eileen Babbitt was talking about, I think, very effectively? I mean, how, first of all, whatever organizational strategies you use have to be based on your ability to listen and understand what it is people who would be otherwise in disagreement with you might recognize, and therefore be able to respond and develop a coalition. I think to the extent that interest groups are pushing entirely their own agenda, it sometimes gets it's both a stimulating way for organizing, and we know that interest groups can have a tremendous impact. There are some that have had a particular impact in the rights area. But to make broader change of the kind we're talking about here, I think you need to listen much more closely to what somebody with whom you might disagree, who is in another interest area, is saying. So that's a sort of repetition of what you've already heard here.
If I can just add to that, John, I think one challenge that faces any cause or community is the ways in which different groups within that community are perceived as either worthy or unworthy of rights, right? So, for example, if you think of immigration and refugees, there are certain communities that have benefited deservingly of refugee asylum status. And then there are others who are treated extremely brutally or callously or inhumanely. And so I guess then the question becomes, do we advocate more loudly to ensure that those people whose voices are being stifled and whose rights are being denied are heard? Or do we find ways to massage our messages to make them more palatable? And this is an ever present challenge for people who are advocating for justice and rights, in terms of how much do we ensure the table is widened, the doors are opened, and how much of it is kind of making people feel comfortable. And it's always a hard balance, I think. Elizabeth?
Yeah, very much.
Thanks for. Thanks for fascinating research. I'm a Fletcher alum and a Carr Fellow and a former lecturer at Tisch, so it's a delight to hear your work, and I'm looking forward to reading the book very much. I have a playful question, I think. If you ask the question, who cares about values and democracy and rights? And you get the answer by asking people. But if we were to take a pragmatist route and perspective and ask John Dewey to do that research project, he would say, well, let's see what people do instead of asking people what they care about. Let's look at their actions and their deeds instead of their words. So if I think about your findings from that pragmatist perspective, I come up with slackers and overachievers. And the slackers are the silent majority, and the overachievers are the hijackers. So
Nice.
I'm curious, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about pitching this as the silent versus the hijacker. Silent isn't necessarily derogatory or critical, but hijackers is a little bit of a critical word. So if we call the majority something as innocuous as silent, and that really active group as hijackers, what do we lose by doing that? And will we gain something by reframing it as the massive amounts of slackers and the tiny bit of overachievers who are really engaged in democracy and showing up for their values?
Well, I think that's a very wonderful, playful, as you say, but actually fairly profound question. It's a good one. And it goes to the nature of some of the conversations we've already been having, which is you certainly, and this is I'll be self-critical in having chosen the word hijackers.
Which I oppose.
Which she opposed. Okay, so we can have this discussion very effectively right here. It's true. I wanted to get people's attention that indeed there was an active minority that was really working to take away rights in certain fundamental ways. So the choice of the term was there. However, the term itself, or any other kind of charged term, can actually be a turnoff to further conversation and discussion. So it's a part of this dilemma that Sushma was referring to earlier, that it's both tactically the choice of the term was to get people's attention, but it probably stood in the way of real dialogue. Fair comment. But you get to state your reason why you were opposed.
Well, I think the book really goes from like the historical to the present age to looking to the future. It's in the realm of values and aspirations and ideals, but also at a very tactical ground level. And I felt like this hijacking frame was very much focused on like what has happened, which is bad, as opposed to the what can we do about it that gives us agency, that gives us power, that builds solidarity. Just like, we don't mention the former president's name in my residence. It's like not allowed. It is really a way to say that our framing is based on the values we uphold, and how do we frame it in that way as opposed to the things that are done to us, if you will, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I understand what you're saying. I agree with some of it, but I would not personally think of that group who have quote unquote hijacked as overachievers. I would really think of it as like a very specific agenda to claim certain spaces, to really ensure that it's democracy for a few.
If I could jump in, I love that provocation. I just want to say, and I think that again, that polarized 80, what was it, 80?
70-30.
70-30, yeah, 70-30. Not only does it, I think, overstate the agreement on democracy, the sort of the upholders of democracy as we understand it, whoever, liberal democracy. I also think it doesn't do justice to all of the mobilization of civil society. I mean, I think the frame right now is contention. That's what I want to say. We are in a moment of contention, and there are a lot of overachievers. The Black Lives Matter movement was the biggest mobilization in history of civil society. And it was very multiracial. It was not a Black movement. It was, it was a movement for empathy around the conditions faced by Black people, but it was not a Black movement. And I think when we phrase it as this silent majority, that was not a silent majority, a silent minority. That was part of an activist overachieving majority that upholds liberal democracy, I think. And so I would want us to, and I think all the contention around school boards, that is activated civil society. I don't like it, but it is activated civil society. And so to your point, I think there are many, many lessons to be learned from the mobilization on all sides of civil society in this moment of profound contention. And so I want to keep thinking about that question about overachievement we'll stop.
So following up on that point, recently we've seen in Black Lives Matter be successful in defunding some police organizations, and we have seen some cities, for instance, kind of reshape the way that they work and the police system works. But with that, there has been a rise in crime, and not correlated at all to those actions or the actions to essentially reform policing. But yet still, these politicians and people who have made these reforms are being taken out of government, removed from their positions. So those strategies are being rolled back.
Yeah.
I know one response that we've heard, and the theme that we've heard all of you touch upon, is that we really need to, as civil society, organize in a way that impacts economics. And you specifically said something around the lines of, okay, well, if we start impacting, economically mobilizing that way, like not choosing certain products, things like that, that would make an impact. But my question here is, one, how do we move forward when our progress is rolled back so quickly? And two, how do we begin to make those fiscal decisions when the wealth disparity is so just growing? It sounds like the answer, being in civil society, is more of a challenge than is necessarily realized.
I'll jump in, and I think others might like to comment on this as well. And I think this may be the last question, and it's a provocative question. I would say that I just read on a social media post today that according to Oxfam, the wealthiest people in the world doubled their wealth during the pandemic. Okay, I don't have the exact numbers, but this has been a constant theme in the inequality report. So when we talk about crime, when we talk about issues of concern, we are highlighting certain issues, but we're not highlighting others. And I think it is a crime that you have people who are starving, who don't have healthcare access, that you have a famine in many countries, that you have people here who are forced to pay for a COVID test when they may be out of a job and you have to pay $100. And there have not been appropriate tax policies in place to tax extremely wealthy people and corporations. So I think we have to situate this narrative, and I implicate the media in this, where there has been this hype around like crime that has been occurring in certain cities, where there have been rollbacks on funding for the police, et cetera. So I think that we have to sort of take a step back and say, how do we address issues of economic inequality and the wealth gap? I do think it is more than just focusing on individual rights. It's really looking at justice and systems in place in order to ensure that, everyone has a seat at the table and not getting distracted by these other messages. So that's my perspective.
Well, I think we do have an opportunity. It's partly what I said in response to your question, but an opportunity right now, based on what we've learned by writing this book, learned about the attitudes of Americans. And it's certainly true, and I agree with you very much, Dana, that obviously that you can't lump together everyone's concept of freedom. Quite the opposite. Everybody has a different concept, et cetera. But what we have learned with respect to economic issues is that the needle has really moved significantly in this country now toward economic justice, dealing with issues of economic inequality. And it's quite separate from politics in a way. It's because the left and the right do meet each other to some extent on this. And that's why we need to learn to talk to each other and more effectively in that way. And we also need, frankly, political leaders who can articulate this effectively so that it actually does, people listen, they get it, they understand, and that it's possible, therefore, to have this kind of a coalition. So I think this is, of all the things that we found in the book, the one to me that was most surprising was to find how much issues of economic justice have now really come into the discourse. They're not there politically because we have so much divided politics and all the various ways in which political opportunists are crowding out this larger theme. But the theme is there, and I think it's an opportunity.
And I think so. This is what I was talking about, and what the book talks about, all these moments in these pivot points of American history, when actually there was the possibility of a broad economic populism. Racial identity was used as the distraction over and over again. So it's something we have to pay really, really close attention to. I think there are specific policies that can be advocated and that would be really broadly supported, like taxing data. How can it be that most of the social media companies are making their fortunes on our data? It's ours. And they don't, the bodega down the street gets taxed for selling potato chips, but Facebook gets all of our data and sells it over and over and over again for free. So I think I agree with you that political leadership is a key piece here, John, and we're bereft. But I think there are specific kinds of policies that could tap into this moment of economic despair. But we have to figure out the racial identity piece. And I think, this thing about communities segregating more on the basis of ideology, that's shocking, but communities have been segregated on the basis of race forever. Mm-hmm. And when you have that kind of segregation, to your point, Eileen, that your experiences are so counterfactual to each other that there's not a way to meet. And so how do we figure out these gathering spaces? How do we figure out these discursive arenas for exploring how we could agree on an economic equality agenda, despite the differences, the vast differences in our experiences? And how do we find these forums so that we can actually explore the similarities through the differences in our experiences?
I mean, any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
No, just grateful for this conversation. Much food for thought. Lovely to meet all of you.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Dana and Eileen, and thank you to all of you for joining us today.
Thank you.